On July 2nd, 2005, I awoke from a dream that my sister was falling and I couldn't catch her. It was my mom calling to deliver news that no parent ever should have to, that her daughter, my sister Emmy, had died in a car accident the night before. That moment completely unraveled the reality that I thought that I knew. Losing someone that I was tied to so closely activated me in ways that I couldn't imagine. It set me on a path of working to understand the way that my own mind and body was impacted by trauma and the role that collective grief has in social justice work. Emmeline Jean Brancato, Emmy, was a cultural anthropology major studying sustainability. As kids, she and I would make art and read as a way of making sense of our world. It was just built into who we were. Anybody that knew Emmy knew her for making these friendship bracelets that she stitched together for her friends and loved ones. She made her clothes, she embroidered her jeans. And as my older sister, she was less than 2 years older than me, she was a role model to me, always pushing me to see the bigger picture of where my story fit into the world around me. And I was a rebellious teenager, and during some tumultuous times in my teenage years, she always had my back. At Emmy's funeral, there's a lot that I don't remember. I've learned that grief is tricky that way. Our brains, in a funny way, protecting us from taking in just as much as we're able to at a time. But what I do remember is the realization that my sister was interconnected with so many more people than I knew. Even as close as we were, that she was part of this broader network, and I was actually just one thread in this weaving of her life. It was both a painful and a beautiful realization for me, and it helped me to begin to see how great an impact an individual person can have on the world around them. So the years immediately after Emmy's death were really hard for me in terms of connecting to my family. I felt really isolated in my grief, which is another way that grief can work. It can make us feel alone. But within that, I think there's also an opportunity for connection, because the truth is, I felt like people in my family couldn't understand what I was going through, but I think we all felt that way, you know? We all had a unique and different and special relationship with Emmy. And my mom helped us to start to see the connections between what we were all dealing with when, in her own process of grieving, she started to cut apart and piece back together those handmade clothes and embroidered garments that my sister made, making memory quilts out of her old clothes and giving them to some of her friends and loved ones. And by having one of these, I started to think of myself as a part of a community of people impacted by a shared trauma. Just after Emmy's accident, I moved to Baltimore and started to study art. I was always an artist, but it was the first time I really began to pursue it in a professional way. So I didn't know what my place was going to be, but Emmy's embroidery thread, I think, helped to lead me into studying textiles. And over the next 2.5 years, I learned how to make things, and I was working with my hands and my body to make art. And in retrospect, I realized I was working through my grief in a nonverbal way by doing this. But it wasn't until I began to think about people and our stories as part of my art practice that I really found my path. And that's when I found the power that our stories can have when they're connected together. This led me, just a couple years after undergrad, to working in a domestic violence shelter for a few years, where I set up an art and craft program, putting into practice what I had learned from my mom and from my own experience of healing from the grief and working through the grief of losing my sister. And I didn't know exactly at the time why I was working at the shelter. I had a sense I wanted to work with a community of women, but I didn't realize that I had a special connection to the issue. So in the shelter, we would quilt and crochet and make things and sit around and talk. And organically in these conversations, as well as in the support groups that I shadowed and sat in on, I began to learn about domestic violence as a system. I learned about the power and control wheel, red flags of domestic violence, the cycle of violence. And in this learning, I finally realized something about those tumultuous teenage years when my sister Emmy had been so supportive. I was rebellious, yes, but also I had been going through something that I didn't have the words to understand, the tools to process, or the tools to know how to support my friends who were going through their own trauma. I had experienced intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And around this time, while I didn't come to the shelter thinking of myself as part of a survivor community, I started to identify as a survivor. Interestingly, I think, my sister's death and my mom's quilt making prepared me to think of myself as part of a community of people affected by a shared trauma. And so around the time that I had this clarifying moment of naming my experiences of sexual assault and intimate partner violence, one of the women in the shelter who was living there at the time and who I learned so much from over the couple years that we were both there, said to me, when I go into the grocery store, I know that there are dozens of people around me that have my experience, but how can we ever find each other? How can we connect? And so that's when we started to take what we were making in the shelter and show it in public spaces with the hope that more people could maybe have a clarifying moment like the one that I had had to identify their experience, find community, break through that isolation that sexual violence and any form of grief and trauma can create. And so here I was, with this experience of losing my sister, of my mom having created these quilts and a community within our family of reconnection, and having the words finally to describe the sexual violence that I had experienced. And I felt driven to create more public conversations about sexual violence. So in 2010, and this was about 10 years after my own experiences in high school of sexual assault, 5 years after losing my sister Emmy, and the same year that I found that language, I co-founded with a friend and collaborator Force Upsetting Rape Culture, an artist and activist collective to create a culture of consent and make public art to share survivor stories. And at first, Force was so incredibly empowering and clarifying to be able to take the experience that I had had and create that for other people, to host conversations about what consent is, to make public art sharing survivor stories, to make infographics that illustrated and explained the fact that sexual assault is a systemic issue. This is not a personal problem. This is not happening in a vacuum. The cycles of violence are continuing because of the lack of resources and support in place. And there is a community of survivors out there to connect to. We had lots of different tactics. One of them was that we made a few culture jams of major brands. This one was of Victoria's Secret. We made a line of consent-themed underwear. Well, we pretended that they made the line. And we did it just as a way of getting a conversation about consent going before it was as mainstream as it is now. We followed that up pretty quickly with a spoof of Playboy, where we pretended their top 10 party school list was about student groups promoting consent on campus, instead of the usual party schools that typically are ones that have high rates of sexual assault. And as we were doing this work of envisioning what a culture of consent in the mainstream would look like, through lightness and play, we also recognized the need to have memorial spaces for survivors of sexual violence. The value of recognizing those experiences in public spaces and creating the opportunity for community connection. So we made a couple of temporary monuments. We hosted community conversations. And ultimately, this led us in 2013 to starting the Monument Quilt Project. Over the next 6 years, we collected stories from survivors of sexual and intimate partner violence, written, painted, and stitched onto red quilt squares, and assembled together in highly public places to create and demand space to heal. We traveled across the US and in Mexico. We blanketed public parks, military bases, football fields, reservations, college campuses, even outside of prisons, as a way of occupying public space and modeling what a community of support for survivors in public could look like. And through this work, we always knew that culture change had to be part of social change and policy change. And at this point, it's important to call back to relationships, because I was becoming part of a much broader network than I even had ever imagined I could be. I was building incredible transformative relationships all the time. And as I learned with Emmy, when I lost her, that I was one thread in her larger story. Anybody that was part of Force during this time, part of the Monument Quilt Project, whether they were staff, whether they were the co-founder, whether they were volunteers, hosting a quilt workshop, making a quilt, that's thousands of people by the end of this project, would have a totally different and equally monumental story to tell about it. So we realized that in order to build this giant monument quilt, we were going to need to get some infrastructure into place, and we were sort of building the ship as it was sailing. So pretty quickly, we're hiring staff and forming a leadership team. Some of the folks from both are pictured here in one of the annual leadership retreats that we had. We raised a lot of money. We got fiscal sponsorship. We also started to deepen our messaging. So not only focusing on the fact that sexual violence is a systemic issue, but also illustrating the connections between sexual violence and other forms of oppression, tribal sovereignty, the criminal justice system, the carceral system as a system that is actually perpetuating violence, not solving it. Looking at the way that immigration policy creates higher rates of sexual violence, like at this display on both sides of the US-Mexico border. And as Force was doing this work, we were probably parallel to hundreds of groups like ourselves around the country and the world doing this organizing of creating safer spaces for survivors. In the lead up to what we all now know was this peak moment of visibility in 2017, the Me Too movement. And I believe that the folks that were part of our work, it was at least a small part of building up to that change, that moment. We started to see the impact of our work in other ways too, just that messages of support for survivors started to become more mainstream. Messages like, you are not alone, you did not deserve it, we believe you. And so Force had grown really quickly. We had gained a lot of power in a short amount of time. And it took me a long time to really see how much power we had gained. And so that leadership team and the staff and members of Force started to call me and the other leaders to accountability about whether we were actually living the values that we were expressing publicly within our organizational culture. They started to point out how we were being driven by a sense of urgency that would lead to cycles of burnout, perfectionism, a focus on the end product instead of the process of doing the work. We had a top-down decision-making process instead of a collective one. And what they were pointing out is the ways that white supremacy culture was manifesting within our organization. And at first, I responded really badly. As a white person, this was a moment of reckoning for me, and I did a pretty bad job. I was defensive. It took me a while to come around to listening and being open and willing to be transformed by that moment. And it wasn't just me. There was a lot of conflict that was happening around Force. Those beautiful, amazing relationships that had been built, there were just so many challenges. There was harm caused, I caused harm was caused to me. A lot of these stories aren't mine to tell, but I think it's important to mention that messiness of activism. It's not that what Force went through was inevitable, because a lot of what we went through could have been prevented with better accountability systems and processes and procedures. However, I do think conflict is inevitable. And I think relationships are difficult. And something that I've started to come around to understanding, as I talked about with a friend recently, my friend Katie and I were talking about activism, and how people get involved in activism with a seed of hope that things can be different, like that moment of clarity that I had had, and that feeling of, we can do something about this. And I would compare that feeling of hope to the love that I had for my sister, because it's sort of like a full, unbridled emotion, like unfiltered, completely allowing ourselves to feel our feelings. And so if we're going there, like if we're allowing ourselves to fully feel, that means that we're gonna feel the bad too. And so the more that I've come to understand and process, the experience of force, the more that I see now that that is the work, the willingness to over and over again be transformed, be unraveled, feel our feelings, be changed. That's the vision for the future, That's the modeling from the inside out of the world that we're building. The other thing, certainly that I learned through that experience in force is that white supremacy culture is trauma. And like other forms of grief and trauma, one of the ways that it operates is to isolate us. And so I'm continuing to follow this thread of grief in my work now and trying to unearth what white supremacy culture has looked like in terms of how it's passed down in my family. In 2020, I left force. The pandemic hit, which gives a whole other understanding of the impact of collective grief. And I had my first child, Willow. And in this work, I'm looking at objects that I have inherited from my family. What are the messages and stories of white supremacy culture that have been embedded in those? And how can I actively resist passing this down in future generations? I'm also working right now on projects that are about envisioning a different reality. In a project called Dream Seeds with my collaborator, Sanahara Amachandra, we're creating a project that, as she says, can tell new stories. And so that seed of what I learned when I lost Emmy is continuing to grow and expand in my mind. But one person that I've learned a lot from is Resmaa Menakem, who says, most of us think of trauma as something that occurs in an individual body, like a toothache or a broken arm. But trauma also routinely spreads between bodies, like a contagious disease. So I believe that the power that art can have is to prevent that spread, is to be the thing that we can use to make sense of our worlds, to tell our own stories, to understand our experiences, and ultimately to create opportunities and space to connect with each other around these experiences and resist that isolation. The beauty of art is giving form to those stories and creating those opportunities. And so, I think about my sister Emmy all the time, and during some of those most difficult times within force, I really wished that I could talk to her about what was happening. But then I have to remember that, my understanding of this idea of interdependence and being part of a bigger ecosystem is deepening, and that includes that people who are no longer with us are with us. And so she is here, she is part of this work. And I don't have a perfect bow to tie on this story because the process is ongoing, but what I can say is as I've had the opportunity to do this reflection, I feel humbled. Like I realize that as much as my grief and experiences with trauma have shaped my life, so many people are bearing so much more every single day. And so what I leave with is an openness, a willingness to continue to learn, to continue to be transformed, a willingness to continue to connect and see what comes next. Thank you.